the Christmas season, I thought I'd give a message on something having to do with Christmas. And what we're going to look at today is something that we are surrounded by every time this time of year. And lately it seems that, we used to wait till after Thanksgiving before we started feeling this season, right? But then it started creeping earlier and earlier, and now it's like Halloween time, and they don't know whether to put the Christmas decorations out or the Halloween decorations out. So my point is that you can't help but be surrounded by an atmosphere of colors and lights and images and music. Music is a big thing. You start hearing the music, some of the radio channels just go all the way over to Christmas music. And so we're bombarded this time of year with this feeling of the season. And one of the icons that probably is the most prevalent is Santa Claus, or St. Nicholas. And so that's going to be our topic today. We're going to take a look at St. Nicholas and who he was, get to know a little bit about him, and we're going to see a couple other figures in history also, and how they interacted with Nicholas, and also what significance did Nicholas play in what we're studying and why we're sitting here today and not in a main or regular line Seventh-day Adventist church. And so I hope this will be an interesting topic, and we'll leave today with a little more than we came with. Now, the first image I have on the screen is what you probably would typically think of when someone would say Santa Claus or St. Nicholas. This is actually what we would call jolly old St. Nick, and he is a friendly figure that the kids look forward to seeing, and has been marketed as someone who gives gifts and also knows whether you've been naughty or nice, but it seems like it doesn't matter these days. You get gifts anyway. All right, so he's an evangelical Santa Claus. He's been transforming into a universalism type Santa Claus, and everyone ends up getting gifts. Now, this next image, this is moving a little more towards a European view of St. Nicholas. Now, depending on where you are in Europe and what culture you're in, you're going to have a lot of variation. But their view of St. Nick is different than ours. St. Nick is a little more stern. He is a little more religious, as you can see. He actually sometimes is depicted as carrying around a whip, right? Correcting people, because he's watching them and watching whether they're naughty or they're nice. So it's the same general concept, but he's more of a taskmaster than our Saint Nick in America. And you'll notice his outfit. What comes to mind when you see him? Yeah, he's looking a little popish. And so that's something you get with the European St. Nicholas. The other thing you get, in contrast to the Western, or more Western, the United St. Nick in the United States, we hear about St. Nicholas and his elves, his little helper elves that are always doing good and working hard and making the toys for the kids. Now, in Europe, they don't have nice little elves. They have one elf that follows St. Nicholas around, and he gets to take care of the kids that were naughty. And his name is Krampus. And he is not a cute little elf. I am not even going to show you an image because I could not find one that was even remotely appropriate. This guy is... Him and St. Nicholas would not be someone you'd want to leave milk and cookies for. That's not the type of St. Nick that most Europeans have. So I just found it interesting that their experience is entirely different than ours. It's more rooted in mysticism, and they bring, especially the further north you get, the more you get some of the elf folklore and real odd stories that get woven into the St. Nicholas story. By the way, the Krampus character has cloven hooves and goat horns. So that gives you an idea of who this is really depicting. Who's behind this? It's very obvious. Now this is a painting of St. Nicholas. This goes back more to the original image of him, and it is entirely religious. And you see that he's wearing the fish mitre also, that commemorates the god Dagon. And he's also got a sun disk behind his head, and he's carrying the Pope's staff, which, when turned down to the ground in judgment, makes a nice little 6. So it's very obvious who is behind this imagery, whether or not St. Nicholas actually looked like this. This is how he is depicted within the church. And it's also obvious who they're patterning him after. Now, along with St. Nicholas, when you look into his past, he was born in Turkey, what we know as modern-day Turkey, and he had a father that was a bishop. And so when his father passed away, he actually sort of took over the family tradition of being bishop. His father placed him, I believe, in a position that would groom him for also becoming a bishop when he got older. And you will also find, when looking into St. Nicholas, that there are many myths and legends behind him. I mean, there's just countless stories about him and the good things that he did. So he now has the reputation of being one that is very giving and giving to the unfortunate, helping the needy. This is, if you ask people what was he like, these are the stories and the myths that you hear about him. And I want to touch on a couple of the stories because they're interesting. Now, in the Bible we read of Jesus traveling in a ship with the disciples. And where was Jesus when the storm came? He was asleep. He wasn't worried about the storm. And the disciples came to him and woke him up and wanted him to save their lives. They thought they were going to die for sure. And so what did Jesus do? He calmed the storm. With his own words, he calmed the waves, stopped the wind. Well, St. Nicholas did the same thing. So St. Nicholas was on a ship with some sailors, and they got into a storm, and St. Nicholas was able to speak and calm the wind and the waves. So this is the attempt to elevate Nicholas to a position that, not necessarily a position, but a reputation of that of Christ. Now, there's also a story in the Bible where Jesus saves a prostitute from death, right? And actually also saves her from the profession itself by his actions. St. Nicholas also has a similar story where he came upon a family. A father could not afford the dowry for his 3 daughters. Now notice there's 3. You will see that in many of these Nicholas stories. They center around 3s. And so this man had 3 daughters, couldn't afford their dowry, and so was going to give them over to that profession because he couldn't afford it. And so what Nicholas did is he stepped in and he would sneak up to the house at night, and one by one would throw these gold bags of gold in. And legend has it that the first night he did it, it fell into one of the daughter's stockings inside the window. And this is where we're getting the stocking story. I think a couple weeks later he came back and put another one through the window and fell in the second stocking. So he did this 3 times, and the father actually caught him the 3rd time. And Nicholas told him, "Don't tell anybody." Does that sound familiar? That's what Jesus, don't tell anybody what happened here. So Nicholas did the same thing. And there's also a story that also involves 3s where Nicholas performed a resurrection on 3 kids that had been abducted. And that's all I'm going to tell you about that story, because again, it's these myths and legends are just not appropriate. But this is where the legend of St. Nicholas comes from. It comes with all this baggage of spiritualistic myths and legends that try to elevate St. Nicholas to the position or level of Christ. Now, because of these legends, he has been elevated, obviously, to a saint, and he is the patron saint of all of these things. I'm not even going to go through and read them all, but I believe, my guess, because I've underlined a couple things here. Against imprisonment, we're going to see why he was the patron saint against imprisonment. And the unmarried girls goes to the story about the dad and the daughters. There's also sailors, and I don't know why they list boatmen and sailors. I thought that was the same thing. But those are all attached to the stories that I told you about, and I believe all these other things are probably attached to their own stories. Yeah, it's against robberies and against robbers. So I don't know what that story is attached to, but there's so many here that you can see how extensive this man's reputation is when it comes to being able to help those that are in need. So here is a summary of the different looks and kind of the evolution that his image has gone through, especially for us here in America. You can see how the one on the left does not look very appealing. You couldn't really market that to kids this time of year. The middle one, a little better, but he's a little scary. But, once you get over to the image on the right, that's a more marketable fellow that you wouldn't mind coming into your house unannounced down the chimney and leaving you gifts. So just a side note, I want to ask you, I'll just ask you the one on the right. Where does this fella live, according to his myth? The North Pole. I hadn't thought of this before, but we read in Isaiah, How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which dost weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. Now, maybe it sounds a little conspiratorial, but you look at the attributes that we have given, not we, but society has given Santa Claus, and he fits all these. Society is brainwashing our kids into replacing Christ with Santa Claus, with Saint Nick. Now we will see that the connection with Christ, or actually the connection with Antichrist, goes way further than just what St. Nicholas wears or where he lives. We read in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1, and now when this was written, the apostolic church was a pure church. And Peter predicted that heresy would start working its way into the Christian church. And over the next 250 years, that is exactly what happened. Pagan traditions and pagan doctrines began weaving themselves into the church. But there were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. Now, over this about 250-year span, these heresies were coming into the church, but as is with God's people, there was a remnant. There were teachers that were doing their best to preserve the truth that was handed to them from the apostles. I'll just name three: Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Novatian. They, in large part, stayed away from these heresies and tried to preserve the pure faith that actually was handed them from the Apostle John. And there's a pretty good line that leads all the way to where we're going to go today. And we also read in prophecy in the book of Daniel about this heir that would come in. Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. I considered the horns. So Daniel was shown a vision, and now he's speaking about this vision. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now we know, as card-carrying, all but one of us, Seventh-day Adventist, who is the little horn? Who is this little horn that's spoken of here in Daniel? The papacy, yes. So we know who that is speaking of. Now there are these other three horns, and I hadn't really noticed this before. I think I made an assumption that the little horn was actually involved in the plucking up. It doesn't say that here. It just says that before them, and it doesn't mean before in time. I was kind of hoping it did, but it doesn't mean before in time. It means in front of them, before them. And so it just means that they were there at the same time. And this is true because as the little horn power was gaining its power, the three horns were being plucked up. Now, the seven horns, on the other hand, were not a threat to the little horn, so they weren't plucked up. Who are the three horns? The three horns are the Hurlei, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. These were three tribes that were Arian tribes, and this is why they were plucked up. It was because of their theology. It's because of what they believed. Now, when you hear Arian, what comes to mind? The Trinity. Now, I wanted to cover this because I know it comes up. So when you're going to be dealing with people on this topic and the word Arian comes up, people's minds that haven't looked into this subject will go here. Right? Have you encountered this? I encountered this with a relative. They thought this is what was involved in believing the Arian teachings. Well, look at how that's spelled. Aryan. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. The Arian that dealt with has to do with white supremacy. Now, this is how Arian is spelled. Now, I looked for a little while trying to find an Arian pastor, a good picture of one. He isn't exactly an Arian. He is a Unitarian. So this is as close as I could find. That's why I put a little question mark on there. And I didn't want to put a picture of myself because people are going to say, oh, now Dustin's saying he's an Arian. I will get to that a little later, and because I would have to qualify it a little too much. But this is what an Arian can look like. So what exactly is an Arian? An Arian is someone who holds to the teachings of Arius. Arius was a priest from Alexandria, Egypt, and he challenged the ideas that were creeping into the church in the 4th century. Actually, the 3rd and the 4th century. And these ideas that he was challenging were the idea that the Father and the Son were co-eternal. And I'm just going to use that term because we're used to that term. I don't want to confuse the issue. They were using more technical terms that are so close to one another that it's hard to get it straight in your mind. But it was basically the idea of whether or not Jesus had a beginning or whether he had no beginning. That was the big fight. And that's the simplest way I could put it. Arius believed that Jesus was truly begotten and thus had a beginning. Those that opposed him believed that Jesus was co-eternal and in some ways interchangeable with the Father and had no beginning. So they couldn't believe John 3:16 in a literal sense. They would have to explain it away with some type of eternal generation, like he was always being begotten. They had to cover up their theological mess by not being able to read or take Scripture as it reads. Like most of us nowadays, Arius was accused of believing things he didn't believe. If you Google Arius, you will get most people saying that he believed Jesus was not divine, and that's not true. We don't have too much of Arius's writings because they were destroyed by the people that condemned him. But what we do have is a couple confessions, and depending on how they were translated and who translated them, it's pretty clear to see that Arius believed in the only begotten Son of God. And some people translate some of his words created, some people translate it begotten. And so, you can't really exactly pin it down because, like I said, we're not allowing him to explain what he believed because those who destroyed him destroyed his writings. In AD 325, Emperor Constantine organized and presided over the Council of Nicaea. And the main issue, the main agenda item at this council was the nature of the Son of God and his relationship to the Father. They called this the Arian heresy. And the reason why this was an issue that rose to the level of calling such a large council was because Arius and his cohorts had convinced several of the bishops at this time that they were right, and 2/3 of all the priests. So they were making a rumble. That's why this happened. If it was just a couple guys over in a corner in Alexandria, this council probably would have not been called, or it would not have been focused on this issue at least. Now, St. Nicholas is who we've been talking to up until this point, before Arius, and he was one present at this council. I know some people believe that maybe he was altogether a myth, but I found some documentation that showed that Nicholas actually signed the register. He was actually one of the attendees. They even know that he was the 151st signer at this council. So there is documentation that he was there, and some of the other stories that go along with it, that those may or may not be entirely true, because a lot of myth does follow him. There were over 300 bishops in attendance, and Nicholas was probably one of the most staunch supporters of the Anti-Arian movement and the strongest defender of the Orthodox Christian position at the time. And like I said before, he was one of them that actually signed the Nicene Creed, which is the document that came out of this council. And this is a picture of Nicholas on the left and Arius on the right. Arius had an opportunity, like most do in councils, to give his testimony and give his viewpoint and the reasons why. Arius argued forcibly about his position, and at great length. As he continued describing his position, Nicholas became more and more agitated and just couldn't stand it. Because in Nicholas's mind, Arius was tearing down the Jesus that he believed in. Finally, Nicholas could no longer stand it. He walked across the hall and slapped Arius in the face. When this happened, the rest of the bishops were startled because someone in Nicholas's position and of his stature should not have obviously not acted in such a way. And so they took him to Constantine and wanted Constantine to deal with him. They turned on him, in other words. He was making them look bad. And so Constantine says, you do what you want with him. It's up to you. So they had him shackled and thrown in prison. So for a time, Nicholas was not in attendance. Now what comes next is part of the legend of Nicholas. Not only did they chain him and throw him in jail, but they took away his garments that let people know that he was a bishop. They also took away his scriptures. So those are the two things, his garments and his scriptures that they took from him. When the jailer came into Nicholas the next morning, he found, legend has it, that he found Nicholas's chains undone and found Nicholas with his garments and with scriptures. Well, legend has it that those that gave Nicholas these things back were none other than Jesus and the Virgin Mary, who appeared to him. And to right the wrong that was done to him, see, you have them pictured right there. If you look up pictures of Nicholas, you will see Jesus and Mary up in the corner often. And this is why. They're depicting the miracle of the reversal of the verdict against Nicholas. And so they gave him back his scriptures and his robe, thus reinstating him as bishop from on high. And some of the stories that you hear, some versions of this story actually go a little bit further. They say not only did this happen to Nicholas, but that Constantine and all of the other bishops were also given visions of this happening. And when the next day came, that they unanimously voted to have him reinstated because Jesus himself and the Blessed Virgin Mary did it and wanted it to happen. This is one of the other many legends of Nicholas.
That proves the Trinity is correct, right?
It actually, yeah, it would, right. So the Council of Nicaea, one of the results of the Council of Nicaea was a document, but this is an edict that was given down. And it says, in addition, if any writing composed by Arius should be found, it should be handed over to the flames. So remember, I mentioned that his writings were all destroyed, and this is why. So that not only will the wickedness of his teachings be obliterated, but nothing will be left even to remind anyone of him. And I hereby make a public order that if someone should be discovered to have hidden writing composed by Arius, and not to have immediately brought it forward and destroyed it by fire, his penalty shall be death. As soon as he is discovered in this offense, he shall be submitted for capital punishment. So the verdict did not go in Arius' favor for certain. And so what we're left with is very little of his writings, only a couple of his confessions. And so it's left up to those that destroyed Arius to give us the quote-unquote history of Arius. And that's why much of it, I believe, is questionable. When you allow the victors to write the history, you seldom get an accurate portrayal of people and events. Also, as a result of the decree of the Council of Nicaea, Arius and his followers were exiled. But even though this happened, the Arian belief continued to grow. So this is in the 300s, and this was just the beginning. Remember Daniel 7:8 that we read earlier? The 3 horns that were plucked up from the root? It took 200 years for that plucking up to occur. It didn't just happen overnight. So this was an actual holy war that was going on and would go on for a couple centuries. Thought this was an interesting quote. This is by Stephen Haskell, and it's from the book The Story of the Prophet Daniel. Ellen White actually commissioned this book. Uriah Smith's book, Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation, was such a success, but it was a very large book. Ellen White wanted a condensed version of it. And so she commissioned Haskell to take that on, and this was the result. And so she really didn't ask him to change anything that I know of, except for the length. It was supposed to be a smaller book than Uriah Smith's. He writes, Constantine and Justinian were 2 men instrumental above all others in forming the papacy and giving it civil power. The contest between Arianism and the Orthodox Catholicism was the means of enthroning the papacy. So everything this story that I've told you about, the papacy rising to power centers around these events. If it didn't go down the way it did, the papacy would not have received its power. And so you can see that there must have been spiritual maneuverings going on behind the scenes that we won't have any idea until the judgment. But this was very important to Satan to set this stage. Otherwise, he could not have had the papacy as his mouthpiece. A power soon to be recognized as the personification of all tyranny swayed the scepter of Rome. and the followers of the one who proclaimed a covenant of peace of Israel would for a period of 1260 years struggle for existence. It's clear that the pioneers saw the significance of this topic. We've studied what they believed on this issue, and this book was written, I believe, after 1900. And so Haskell and others both saw clearly that this disagreement between the God of the little horn power and the God of those who were staying faithful to the teachings of the apostles was a very important thing. Just got this one last slide to share with you. And Athanasius was an opposer of Arius. And I think you might be able to relate with what is said here. Listen to this. May God console you, he says. What saddens you is the fact that others, the Arian heretics, have occupied the churches by violence, while during this time you are on the outside. It is a fact that they have the premises, but you have the apostolic faith. They can occupy our churches, but they are outside the true faith. You remain outside the palaces of worship, but the faith dwells in you. Let us consider what is more important, the place or the faith? The true faith, obviously. Is that a little topsy-turvy on what's happening today? It's a true statement. He just doesn't know what the truth is. And the tables were turned for 200 years on those that were promoting this heresy. And eventually they got their way, and they, in large part, extinguished the Arian teaching. There were still those that believed the truth, like the Waldenses. I couldn't find the documentation on it, so that's why I didn't share it. But a friend of mine said that he has documentation that the Waldenses also believed the truth about God. And so we'll be sharing that in the future, I'm sure. I just thought it was pretty ironic that he was trying to reassure people of being in the building doesn't matter as long as the faith is inside of you. So today we've seen that that Nicholas and Arius were on two opposite sides of this issue, this important doctrinal issue. And like Nick read in the quote earlier, it's as distinct as midnight. There shouldn't be any gray area here in our minds. It's either you are following the God of the Bible, or you are following the God of the little horn power. There's not going to be any gray area if you dig deep enough. They will be as distinct as midnight. And from where I'm standing, Arius seems like the saint. And Arius was the one that was condemned. But Nicholas got the label saint. We are called to be saints. And what does saint mean? It means to be set apart for a special use or a holy use. When I read the story of St. Nicholas, he was not set apart for a holy use. He was an instrument of Satan. Now Arius, on the other hand, more qualified as being set apart for a holy use. He gave himself to the truth. Nicholas put himself on the side of the Antichrist power. Not just literally in that he supported the little horn movement, but he also denies the Father and the Son, which we're told is Antichrist. And so it's fitting that most of the depictions of St. Nicholas make him appear as Antichrist. He's wearing the same clothes. He looks like Antichrist. That's because his teachings also were Antichrist. It's very fitting. So what I am calling you to do today is when we get to this season, this Christmas season, to look and find opportunities to take advantage of the season. And what I mean by that is people are open. I mean, we've got a president that is telling people about Jesus and how he can save mankind from their sins. People are open to things, and he's doing it for political reasons, but this time of year, the average heart is going to be more receptive to spiritual things, and so we, as people that are learning about the one true God, should take advantage of that. And every opportunity, be willing and able to share what we know about the one true God. We've been given a job to do as Seventh-day Adventists. We are to spread the three angels' messages, and the truth about God is woven throughout all three messages. We should take every opportunity because time is short. Probation is about to close. And next week we're going to hear a sermon that I hope deals a little bit with how close we are to the close of probation. And God has given us landmarks to show us how close we are to this event. And we can't take any liberties when it comes to our time. We need to be ready and be living like he is coming tomorrow. And so every opportunity we have in this season, I challenge you to share with those that are within your sphere of influence about the one true God.